We often think of the law as this rigid, fixed set of rules, black and white. But what happens when those rules are old, maybe a little unclear, or they just don't account for the world we live in today? Well, today, we're diving into the really complex and, believe it or not, surprisingly human act of interpreting the law.
So think about it this way. Is reading a law just like reading a recipe? A clear set of instructions. You take the facts of a case, you apply the law, and bam, you get a clean, predictable outcome. But is it really ever that simple?
Because here's the thing. What if that recipe is 100 years old? What if the language is kind of ambiguous, or maybe it's been translated from another language and something got lost? And what if it's calling for ingredients you just can't find anymore? That right there is the challenge that judges face every single day.
So, that gap between the ideal of law as this perfect, foolproof instruction manual and the messy reality of applying it, that's where our journey really begins. Let's dig into that ideal versus the reality.
On paper, the system is supposed to be this clean assembly line, right? The legislature makes the laws, the judiciary just applies them. Simple. But in the real world, that line gets broken all the time. Laws can be unclear, totally outdated, and as our society changes, judges are forced to be more than just referees. They have to become interpreters.
Okay, so if a judge has to interpret, what's guiding them? Well, the first and maybe the most critical factor is a really simple one. Judges are human. They aren't robots just processing code. And this idea leads us straight to a school of thought called legal realism. It basically argues that a judge's personal background, their experiences, their values, even their politics, all of that inevitably shapes how they see a case. It's not just about applying objective rules, they bring their whole selves to the bench.
The old school textbook way of looking at it is this really neat formula. You take the statute, add the facts, and it equals a decision. Clean, predictable, simple.
But the realists, they throw a huge new variable into that equation, the judge's own mind. Suddenly, their values and experiences become a key part of the machine that produces the final decision. It just goes to show that interpretation is an active process, not a passive one.
But hey, it's not just about what's going on in the judge's head. Sometimes the problem is baked right into the language of the law itself. So what happens when the words on the page are the real source of the confusion?
Let's look at a real-world example from Sri Lanka. It's fascinating. Bills are often first drafted in English and then translated into the country's official languages. Now, anyone who's ever used an online translator for something important knows that translation is an art, not a science. Nuance, context, and the original lawmaker's intent can get completely lost, and that creates massive legal ambiguity. And look, this isn't some new 21st century problem. As this great quote from Justice Innes points out, even when you're trying your best, language is an imperfect tool. The words you choose might say more or less than what you actually meant. The big takeaway here? Perfect clarity in the law is often just an illusion. All right, this is where we get to what might be the biggest challenge of all. What happens when the language of the law doesn't just confuse things, but actively excludes entire groups of people simply because it was written for a totally different time? Just look at this timeline. It shows a really powerful evolution. Historically, the law just used masculine pronouns, like he, as a catch-all, which, you could argue, reinforced men as the default in society. Now we've seen a really positive shift towards gender-neutral terms like person, but the law is now facing its next great interpretive challenge. How do you recognize identities that exist beyond the simple male-female binary? And we're not talking about a small niche issue here. This has a huge impact. In Sri Lanka, for example, it's estimated that about 12% of the population identifies as part of the LGBTIQ community. When your laws are written in strictly binary terms, a huge portion of your population is basically rendered legally invisible. That can deny them basic rights in everything from healthcare to employment.
So when we say third gender, what are we actually talking about in this context? Well, it's a category for people who just don't fit neatly into the male or female boxes. It's a concept that's existed in many cultures for a long, long time, but it's one that traditional Western legal language often has no words for.
But legal systems are starting to adapt, which is great to see. India's Supreme Court made a landmark ruling back in 2014. Countries like Germany and Pakistan have also taken major steps to legally recognize non-binary identities. What we're seeing is this global trend towards making the law more inclusive of the world as it actually is today.
So after all this, what's the big takeaway? It's that this whole business of interpretation, it's not a flaw in our legal system, it's not a bug. It's actually a necessary feature, a tool that makes sure that justice can adapt and evolve over time.
And that leads to this really powerful and, yeah, sometimes controversial idea of the judiciary as social engineers. The argument goes that when lawmakers fail to update old laws, the courts have a duty to step in. Through interpretation, they can bridge that gap between an outdated text and our modern reality, making sure rights apply to everyone, even people the original authors never even considered.
So it all comes down to this one huge question. When the law is silent on the most pressing issues of our time, who should be the one to speak for justice? It's not just some abstract legal debate. It's a constant negotiation between the words of the past and the needs of the present. And it's a powerful reminder that law isn't just something you read, it's something that is lived. Thanks for watching.